Welcome to the Hidden Library. Tonight, we take down a volume long left undisturbed, one that was set aside when questions were inconvenient and answers came too close to the truth. Before we begin, if you enjoy discovering stories like this, like and subscribe to keep the Hidden Library open, and share in the comments where you're listening from and what first drew you into this mystery. Now, turn the page carefully and let the story speak for itself. The Day the Postman Lied. Chapter 1. A Village of Habits. The railway carriage jolted over a set of points, and Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-stitch. Through the window, the countryside had shifted from the untidy sprawl of towns to something older, more deliberate. Hedgerows lined the fields in patterns that predated maps. Church spires marked villages like pins on cloth. Nearly there, Jane. Mrs. Violet Ashworth sat across from her, a woman whose face had accumulated comfortable lines rather than bitter ones. Wychcombe Saint Giles hasn't changed a jot since you visited before the war. You'll find it restful after St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needles clicking in rhythm with the train wheels. I have always found that villages which pride themselves on never changing are precisely the ones where the most interesting things occur. Unchanging surfaces can hide considerable activity beneath. Mrs. Ashworth laughed. You haven't altered either, Jane. Still looking for mysteries and tea leaves. Not tea leaves, dear. Human nature, that remains disappointingly consistent. The train slowed as it approached Wychcombe Halt, a station that appeared to exist solely through force of habit. Two porter boys lounged against a trolley, and the station master consulted his pocket watch with the gravity of a man timing the movements of planets. The village itself lay a quarter-mile walk along a lane so precisely bordered by wildflowers that Miss Marple suspected a gardener came weekly to maintain the appearance of naturalness. Wychcombe Saint Giles arranged itself around a Norman church and a green where ducks inhabited a pond with proprietary confidence. The houses varied only in their degree of respectability, from very respectable to extraordinarily so. There's Mr. Crane with the afternoon post, Mrs. Ashworth remarked as they crossed the green. A man of perhaps 60 moved along the far side with mechanical precision, his leather bag worn to the exact shape of long service. He paused at each gate, consulted the letters in his hand, proceeded or moved on with no wasted motion. His face had the weathered quality of a man who had walked the same route in all seasons for decades. He delivered my first letter here 30 years ago. Mrs. Ashworth continued. A note from my mother, worried I'd made a dreadful mistake moving to such a quiet place. Mr. Crane handed it to me at the garden gate and said, Welcome to Wychcombe, Mrs. Ashworth. You'll find we take care of our own here. And they have, Jane. They truly have. Miss Marple observed the postman's steady progress. He raised his cap to an elderly lady pruning roses, exchanged a word with a maid shaking rugs, navigated the village like a man walking through his own sitting room in the dark. Certainty in every step. Such reliability must be a great comfort, Miss Marple said. Oh, we set our clocks by Mr. Crane. The north side of the green receives post at 2:30, the south side at 2:45. Hasn't varied in living memory. They turned into Mrs. Ashworth's cottage, a square stone building with windows that overlooked the church. The interior smelled of beeswax and the particular mustiness of books left too long in the sun. Miss Marple settled herself in a chair that had clearly been positioned to command a view of the street. You'll want tea, Mrs. Ashworth said, and then perhaps you'll come with me to Mrs. Palmer's. She's having a few ladies this afternoon, and they're desperate for fresh conversation. I'm afraid we tend toward repetition here. I should be delighted. The gathering at Mrs. Palmer's proved to be exactly what Miss Marple had anticipated. 5 women of varying ages arranged in a sitting room that displayed china in proportion to the family's social aspirations. The conversation had the polished quality of topics discussed many times before, each speaker knowing precisely where to pause for laughter or sympathy. "Miss Marple has come from St. Mary Mead," Mrs. Ashworth announced. "She knew my people before I married." Mrs. Palmer, a thin woman whose jewelry suggested recent widowhood and comfortable means, presided over the teapot. "How fortunate for Violet. We do so want her to have company. One worries about ladies living alone." "Violet manages beautifully," said a younger woman introduced as Mrs. Dorothy Fletcher. "Better than some who have family close by." The remark produced a meaningful silence that Miss Marple recognized immediately. Someone in the village lived with family and found it burdensome. Village conversations were like this, filled with references that meant everything to those present and required careful excavation by outsiders. "You're thinking of poor Miss Fenwick," Mrs. Palmer said finally. "Such a trial for her, that nephew." "Leonard Fenwick." Mrs. Fletcher's voice carried precision. "He visits every few weeks, stays precisely 2 hours, and leaves looking as though he's been denied his supper." "He has expectations," another lady murmured. "Expectations don't pay a man's debts." This came from an elderly woman near the window, her fingers busy with embroidery. "My niece in London moves in the same circles." The young man has been unfortunate at cards. Miss Marple accepted her tea and a biscuit, filing away the information as methodically as Mr. Crane sorted his letters. A nephew with debts and an elderly aunt with property. The pattern appeared in every village, predictable as the seasons. "Miss Fenwick keeps herself very much to herself now," Mrs. Palmer continued. "One hardly sees her except at church. Mrs. Holt manages everything." "Mrs. Holt is her companion?" "For 15 years. Devoted, absolutely devoted, though I sometimes wonder if Miss Fenwick might benefit from more varied society. Dr. Rowan says she mustn't be agitated, but surely isolation can't be healthy either." The conversation drifted to Dr. Rowan's qualities, his modern ideas, his patience with elderly patients, his unfortunate luck with investments that kept him working when he might have retired. Then to the vicar's wife, to the proposed improvements to the village hall, to someone's daughter who had made a questionable marriage. Miss Marple listened, her needles working steadily through the pale blue wool in her lap. The rhythm of village life unfolded in the pauses between words, the glances exchanged, the topics introduced and abandoned. She learned that the Cranes lived in a cottage near the church, that their daughter Emily had recently left a position at the vicarage, under circumstances no one quite wished to detail, that Mr. Crane took his responsibilities with almost religious seriousness. "He's a good man," Mrs. Palmer said firmly when the subject arose. "Whatever difficulties Emily may have encountered, her father remains above reproach." The others murmured agreement, but Miss Marple detected something beneath the certainty. A collective decision to believe, perhaps. Villages needed their reliable figures, their fixed points. Mr. Crane delivered the post at the same time each day, rain or shine, and had done so for 30 years. Such constancy became a kind of truth in itself, something to depend upon when other things shifted. As the afternoon light slanted through Mrs. Palmer's windows, Miss Marple considered the tableau before her, women who knew each other too well, a village that clung to its routines with both comfort and desperation, and somewhere in the background, an elderly recluse with a disappointing nephew and expectations that might or might not be met. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where patterns repeated themselves with minor variations. Human nature, she had long ago concluded, lacked imagination. People made the same mistakes their neighbors had made, committed the same sins, told the same lies. The details changed. The fundamentals never did. Mrs. Ashworth caught her eye and smiled. "Not quite the excitement of your own village, I'm afraid." Miss Marple returned the smile and said nothing. Experience had taught her that excitement in a village was rarely the kind one wished for, and when it came, it often wore the most ordinary face imaginable. The face, for instance, of a postman who had never failed in his duty. Chapter 2. An Unexpected Death. The church bells had just finished their Sunday morning call when Mrs. Ashworth received the telephone message. Miss Marple watched her friend's face shift from pleasant anticipation of luncheon to something tighter, more careful. That was Mrs. Palmer. Mrs. Ashworth replaced the receiver with precision. Miss Fenwick died yesterday afternoon. Mrs. Holt found her in the sitting room. How very sad. Miss Marple set down her teacup. She cannot have been very old. 68, I believe. Dr. Rowan had warned her about her heart for years, apparently. Mrs. Palmer says it was quite peaceful. She simply slipped away in her chair. One must be grateful for that, at least. Yet as they walked to church, for death did not excuse one from observance in Wychcombe Saint Giles, Miss Marple found herself thinking of Mrs. Palmer's tea party 2 days before. The women discussing Miss Fenwick with that particular quality of sympathy reserved for those whose loneliness was partly self-imposed. A recluse with a demanding nephew and a devoted companion. Now the recluse was dead, and the nephew would have his expectations met, and the devoted companion would need to seek another position. The pattern was almost tedious in its predictability. The vicar spoke of mortality and Christian duty with the comfortable assurance of a man who had delivered the same sermon, with minor variations, at every unexpected funeral for 30 years. The congregation listened with the attention one gave to familiar music. Miss Marple's gaze drifted across the pews, noting who had come and who had stayed away. Leonard Fenwick occupied the family pew, his face arranged in appropriate grief. A handsome man, Miss Marple observed, with a kind of features that suggested charm deployed regularly and successfully. His suit fit well enough to indicate either inherited money or recent expenditure. The hands gripping the prayer book were steady. Mrs. Holt sat 3 rows behind, isolated by the peculiar mathematics of service. Not family, not quite friend, not servant. Her face had the raw quality of genuine distress, eyes red-rimmed and hands clutching a handkerchief already damp from use. Dr. Rowan sat near the back, his medical bag placed carefully under the pew as though death might require his services even here. He was younger than Miss Marple had imagined from Mrs. Palmer's description, perhaps 45, with the kind of weariness that came from years of night calls and unpaid bills. After the service, the congregation gathered in knots on the church green, conducting the necessary social rituals of condolence and speculation. Such a shock, Mrs. Fletcher said, joining Miss Marple and Mrs. Ashworth near the lych gate, though I suppose we ought to have expected it. Dr. Rowan had said her heart was terribly weak. Was she alone when it happened? Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Holt had stepped into the garden to cut flowers. She was gone perhaps 20 minutes. When she returned, Miss Fenwick had simply stopped. Mrs. Fletcher lowered her voice. The tea things were still on the table. There was a letter beside her chair, unopened. How very unlike her. Mrs. Palmer had joined them, breathless from crossing the green. Miss Fenwick always opened her post immediately. She used to say it was ill-mannered to let correspondence wait. Perhaps she felt unwell, Mrs. Ashworth suggested. Dr. Rowan said everything appeared quite normal, no signs of distress. She might have been sleeping, except... Mrs. Palmer trailed off with the delicacy required when discussing the newly dead. The funeral would be Wednesday, they learned. Leonard Fenwick had made the arrangements with efficiency that bordered on haste. Mrs. Holt would stay at the house until matters were settled, though what would become of her afterward remained unclear. Miss Marple and Mrs. Ashworth walked home through the village, past cottages where curtains twitched and doors stood ajar to catch fragments of conversation from passers-by. Death energized Wychcombe Saint Giles in a way that ordinary life could not. "I ought to call on Mrs. Holt," Mrs. Ashworth said. "Pay my respects properly. That would be kind. Perhaps tomorrow?" Monday afternoon found them approaching Miss Fenwick's house, a substantial Georgian building set back from the road behind iron railings that needed paint. The garden showed signs of Mrs. Holt's recent labor. fresh flower beds turned, roses dead-headed with precision, a house preparing for an absence. Mrs. Holt received them in the drawing-room, a space that felt suspended between occupancy and abandonment. The furniture remained precisely arranged, but the air had gone stale. Dust motes hung in the afternoon light like accusations. "How kind of you to come." Mrs. Holt's voice carried the flat exhaustion of grief. Miss Fenwick would have appreciated it. She did not have many visitors these last years. "It must have been a terrible shock," Mrs. Ashworth said. "I keep thinking I ought to have noticed something. Some sign." Mrs. Holt twisted the handkerchief in her lap, but she seemed quite herself that morning. "We had breakfast together as always. She read the newspaper. We discussed the church bazaar." "You mustn't torment yourself," Mrs. Ashworth assured her. Miss Marple's gaze travelled across the room, noting details with the absorption of someone reading a familiar text in a new edition. The tea things remained on a side table, cups and saucer and pot arranged as though waiting for someone to pour. A book lay open on the arm of a chair, a novel by Mrs. Pope, Henry Wood. The ribbon marker placed at Chapter 3, and on the writing desk, near the window, a letter. The envelope bore a London postmark from Saturday, the address written in the careful script of professional correspondence. "The letter," Miss Marple said gently. "Mrs. Palmer mentioned it had not been opened." Mrs. Holt followed her gaze. Yes, most unlike her. She always attended to her correspondence immediately after breakfast. But this must have arrived with the afternoon post, and by then, Mr. Crane delivered it that afternoon. He must have done. It has Saturday's postmark, you see. Miss Marple rose and crossed to the desk, her movements unhurried. She examined the envelope without touching it, noting the solicitor's name embossed in the corner. Hartley and Sons, Lincoln's Inn Fields. The kind of firm that handled wills and property transfers and the orderly conclusion of lives. From her solicitors, Mrs. Holt confirmed. She had been expecting correspondence from them, some matter regarding the estate, I believe. "And you found her before she could read it?" "I had gone to cut roses for the drawing room. Perhaps 20 minutes, no more. When I returned, she was—" Mrs. Holt's composure fractured. "Sitting just as you see the chair now, quite peaceful, the teacup half empty beside her." They took their leave shortly after, Mrs. Ashworth murmuring the necessary platitudes. Miss Marple said little, her mind occupied with the arrangement of objects in that suspended room. A woman who always opened her post immediately. A letter from her solicitors, unopened. Tea half drunk. As they walked back through the village, they passed Mr. Crane completing his afternoon round. He touched his cap to them with his customary courtesy, but Miss Marple noticed the gesture lacked its usual confidence. His face had a grey quality, as though he had slept poorly. "Good afternoon, Mr. Crane," Miss Marple said. "Such a sad business about Miss Fenwick." "Indeed, madam, a great loss to the village." His fingers tightened on the leather strap of his bag. "I understand you delivered a letter to her on Saturday afternoon, from her solicitors in London." Something shifted behind his eyes. "Saturday, madam. No, I believe that letter came Friday. I delivered it Friday morning with the usual post." "How curious." Miss Marple's tone remained pleasant, conversational. "The postmark quite clearly shows Saturday's date. Postmarks can be difficult to read." Mr. Crane's voice had gone stiff. "One does one's best to remember, but after 30 years and thousands of letters, the days occasionally blur together. I'm quite certain it was Friday." He touched his cap again and moved on, his steps measured but somehow urgent, the rhythm of a man walking away from an uncomfortable conversation. Mrs. Ashworth waited until they had turned the corner. How strange. Why should he misremember such a thing? Miss Marple said nothing for a moment, watching the postman's retreating figure navigate the village green with its decades of familiarity. A man who had never varied his route, never missed a delivery, never faltered in his duty. "In St. Mary Mead," she said finally. There was a greengrocer who had weighed vegetables honestly for 40 years. When he finally made an error in his scales, everyone assumed the customer must be mistaken. 40 years of honesty, you see, becomes its own kind of proof. "You think Mr. Crane is mistaken about the delivery?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that when a man who has never lied before suddenly does so, it merits a certain degree of attention." The church bells marked the hour across the village, their sound falling into silence like stones into still water. Chapter 3. Patterns and Inconsistencies. Miss Fenwick's funeral took place on a Wednesday that threatened rain but never quite delivered. The sky hung low and grey, giving the mourners an excuse for their subdued expressions. Miss Marple stood with Mrs. Ashworth near the back of the churchyard, observing the assembly with the attention one might give to a painting where each figure contributed to the whole composition. Leonard Fenwick accepted condolences with practiced ease, his hand extended in precisely the right gesture of gratitude mixed with grief. The black armband on his sleeve appeared new, the fabric still crisp. He stood taller than he had in church on Sunday, as though some weight had lifted from his shoulders. "He seems almost relieved," Mrs. Ashworth murmured. "Grief takes many forms," Miss Marple replied, though she privately agreed with the observation. Mrs. Holt stood apart from the main gathering, her isolation emphasized by the umbrella she clutched despite the rainless sky. She had wept throughout the service, the kind of tears that came from genuine loss rather than social obligation. When Leonard Fenwick approached her afterward, she turned away with a movement that suggested long-standing antipathy rather than momentary emotion. "They never got along," Mrs. Fletcher explained, materializing beside them with the timing of someone who had been waiting for an opportunity to share information. Mrs. Holt thought he pestered his aunt for money, and Miss Fenwick always defended him, which made matters worse between them. "The companion's position must have been difficult," Miss Marple said. "Oh, terribly. 15 years of managing Miss Fenwick's correspondence, her household, her health, and now nothing to show for it except a month's wages and a character reference." Mrs. Fletcher shook her head, though I suppose she ought to have expected it. Miss Fenwick made no secret of leaving everything to her nephew. Everything. The house, the investments, the lot. Leonard was her only living relative, you see. There was talk once that she might remember some of the village charities, but that came to nothing. Dr. Rowan passed them, his bag in hand, even at a funeral. He looked more exhausted than grief-stricken, the kind of weariness that accumulated over years rather than days. He nodded to Miss Marple with the courtesy of someone who had been introduced but could not quite place the connection. The gathering dispersed in the manner of such occasions, people moving in small clusters toward their homes or the tea shop, or the continuation of lives momentarily interrupted by death. Miss Marple noticed Leonard Fenwick in conversation with a sharp-faced man in an expensive coat. A solicitor's coat, she thought, with its careful tailoring and conservative cut. "That will be Mr. Hartley," Mrs. Fletcher confirmed. "Came down from London this morning. The will shall be read tomorrow, I expect. Not that there's any mystery about its contents." Miss Marple and Mrs. Ashworth took a different route home, one that led past the row of cottages near the church. Miss Marple had suggested the walk, claiming an interest in the village architecture. Mrs. Ashworth, who knew her friend well enough to suspect ulterior motives, accompanied her without comment. The Cranes' cottage sat third in the row, distinguished by a neat garden and curtains that had been darned but remained spotlessly clean. As they approached, the door opened and Emily Crane emerged, a basket over her arm. She started at the sight of visitors, her face coloring. "Good afternoon," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "You must be Emily. I'm staying with Mrs. Ashworth." "Yes, miss." The girl's voice came barely above a whisper. She was perhaps 22, with the kind of prettiness that would fade early if circumstance proved unkind. Her dress had been let down at the hem, the alteration visible in the slight difference in fabric color. "I understand you worked at the vicarage." The color in Emily's cheeks deepened to scarlet. "For a time, miss, but that's finished now." "Such unfortunate business," Mrs. Ashworth said gently. "Mrs. Palmer mentioned there had been some misunderstanding about the church funds." "There was no misunderstanding." Emily's chin lifted with unexpected defiance. "I never took anything. The money was there when I left the office, and Mrs. Palmer knows it. But once someone decides you're the sort who steals, the truth stops mattering." "Emily." Mr. Crane appeared in the doorway, his postman's uniform replaced by Sunday clothes that sat awkwardly on his frame. "Mind your tongue. I only said what's true, Father. Truth or not, it's not for you to defend yourself to strangers." His tone softened slightly. "Go on with your errand. Your mother needs those things from the shop." Emily ducked her head and hurried past them, the basket swinging against her hip. Mr. Crane watched her go with an expression that mixed pride and pain in equal measure. "You must forgive my daughter," he said to Miss Marple. "She's had a difficult time of late." "It must be trying for you both," Miss Marple replied. "Particularly now, with Miss Fenwick's death. I understand she took an interest in Emily's situation." Mr. Crane's face went still. Miss Fenwick was a kind lady. She believed in giving people second chances. She was expecting a letter from her solicitors, I believe, about some change to her arrangements. "I wouldn't know about that, miss. I only deliver the post. What people do with it after is their own business." "Of course. Though you did mention you delivered that particular letter on Friday rather than Saturday." "I remember my rote, miss." His voice had gone flat, defensive. "Friday morning, first delivery." "The postmark?" "Postmarks can be wrong, smudged or misread. But I know what I delivered and when." He stepped back toward his door. "Good afternoon, ladies." The door closed with finality, leaving them standing on the narrow path between cottages. Mrs. Ashworth waited until they had turned the corner. "Jane, what are you doing?" The poor man is clearly distressed enough without interrogation. "I'm not interrogating. I'm merely noting inconsistencies." "To what purpose?" Miss Marple paused to adjust her gloves, a gesture that bought time for thought. "In St. Mary Mead, there was a young woman accused of stealing from her employer. The evidence appeared quite damning. Money missing, the girl the only one with access. But then it transpired that the employer's son had taken it to pay gambling debts, and the girl had simply been convenient to blame." "You think Emily Crane was falsely accused?" "I think that Miss Fenwick believed so, and I think that belief may have had consequences." Miss Marple resumed walking, her pace measured. A wealthy woman without children, disappointed in her nephew's behavior. A young woman wrongly accused, her father a pillar of village reliability. A letter from solicitors about changing arrangements. An unopened letter beside a body. And a postman who suddenly cannot remember which day he delivered it. You're suggesting Miss Fenwick meant to change her will in Emily's favor. I'm suggesting that when patterns emerge, one ought to pay attention to them." They walked in silence for a moment, the only sound their footsteps on the pavement and the distant bleating of sheep in the fields beyond the village. "Leonard Fenwick has debts," Mrs. Ashworth said finally. Mrs. Palmer's niece confirmed it. "Gambling debts, specifically. Rather substantial ones." "Did she indeed? And Dr. Rowan has been treating Miss Fenwick for her heart condition for 3 years. He prescribed digitalis for the palpitations." Miss Marple nodded, filing the information with the precision of a librarian shelving books. "Digitalis, a medicine that strengthened the heart in small doses and stopped it entirely in large ones. Every village doctor kept it in his bag, and every village gossip knew of its dual nature." "Has anyone suggested Miss Fenwick's death was anything other than natural?" Mrs. Ashworth asked. "Not that I'm aware of." Then why does it trouble you? Miss Marple considered the question as they reached Mrs. Ashworth's gate. The cottage windows reflected the grey sky, turning the glass into mirrors that showed nothing but clouds and the possibility of rain that never fell. Because, she said finally, when a man like Mr. Crane, who has been honest for 30 years, suddenly lies about something as simple as which day he delivered a letter, it suggests he has a reason. And reasons, in my experience, are rarely innocent. She opened the gate and passed through, leaving Mrs. Ashworth to follow. Inside, over tea, they spoke of other things, but Miss Marple's needles clicked with particular intensity, the rhythm of someone thinking through a problem that had not yet revealed its full shape. Chapter 4. The Postman's Burden. Inspector Dryden arrived in Wychcombe Saint Giles on a grey Thursday morning, his presence announced by the arrival of a police motor car that drew curtains aside the length of the high street. He was a lean man with the patient eyes of someone who had learned that truth emerged slowly, like photographs developing in chemical baths. Miss Marple first encountered him at Mrs. Ashworth's door. "Inspector Dryden, County Police." He removed his hat. "I'm looking for a Miss Jane Marple. I understand she's staying with you, Mrs. Ashworth." "I'm Miss Marple." She stepped forward, her knitting bag over one arm. "How may I help you? Perhaps we might speak inside." The sitting room felt smaller with the inspector's presence, though he took up little physical space. He settled into the chair Miss Marple indicated, his notebook already in hand. "I received an anonymous letter 3 days ago," he began without preamble, "regarding the death of Miss Harriet Fenwick. The letter suggested her death warranted closer examination." "Anonymous letters are so often the work of spite," Mrs. Ashworth said. "Usually, yes. But this one contained specific details about Miss Fenwick's habits and her final afternoon. Details that proved accurate when I made inquiries." He turned to Miss Marple. "I'm told you visited the house after the death, that you spoke with Mrs. Holt. A condolence call, nothing more. And yet you questioned the postman about his delivery schedule. Twice." Miss Marple's needles paused. "You have been thorough, Inspector. The village is small. People talk." He consulted his notebook. "Dr. Rowan has agreed to an examination of the body. The exhumation took place this morning." Mrs. Ashworth's teacup rattled against its saucer. "You suspect foul play?" "I suspect nothing yet. But when an anonymous letter suggests poison, and when certain details don't align properly, examination becomes prudent." He looked at Miss Marple. "The letter mentioned digitalis. Dr. Rowan confirms he prescribed it for Miss Fenwick's heart condition. A therapeutic dose strengthens the heart. A larger dose stops it entirely, often leaving few obvious signs." "How dreadful," Mrs. Ashworth murmured. "The preliminary findings suggest elevated levels in the tissue samples. We should have confirmation by tomorrow." Inspector Dryden leaned forward slightly. "I'm told you have some experience with these matters, Miss Marple. That you've assisted the police before?" "I have occasionally observed certain patterns." "Then perhaps you'll share your observations about this case. Why the interest in the postman?" Miss Marple set down her knitting, arranging it carefully in her lap. "Mr. Crane insisted he delivered a particular letter on Friday. The postmark showed Saturday. It seemed an unusual mistake for a man who has been punctual and accurate for 30 years. The letter from the solicitors in London. You've seen it?" "I have. Mr. Hartley was quite helpful once I explained the circumstances." Inspector Dryden's voice carried no inflection. The letter informed Miss Fenwick that the documents for changing her will were prepared and awaited her signature. She intended to disinherit her nephew and leave a substantial bequest to Emily Crane. The words fell into the quiet room like stones into deep water, their ripples spreading outward. "Leonard Fenwick doesn't know this?" Mrs. Ashworth asked. "Not officially. The new will was never signed, never executed. The existing will stands, leaving everything to him." Inspector Dryden closed his notebook. But if he somehow learned of his aunt's intentions— "You have a motive," Miss Marple said quietly. "I have half a dozen motives. Leonard Fenwick needed money desperately. Mrs. Holt had served faithfully for 15 years with no security for her future. Dr. Rowan's investments had failed, leaving him in debt. Emily Crane stood to gain a fortune. And Mr. Crane— He paused. Mr. Crane had reason to protect his daughter from disappointment or danger. You suspect them all? I suspect anyone who had access to Miss Fenwick's tea that afternoon, knowledge of her digitalis prescription, and motive to prevent that letter from being read. He stood. I'll be speaking with each of them over the next day. I thought it courteous to inform you first, given your interest in the matter. After he left, Mrs. Ashworth poured fresh tea with hands that trembled slightly. Murder in Wychcombe Saint Giles. Human nature operates the same way in every village, Miss Marple said. The setting changes, the passions do not. That afternoon, Miss Marple took another walk through the village. The news of the inspector's presence had spread with the efficiency of wind through wheat fields. Doors stood ajar. Voices carried on the air, speculating and theorizing with the energy of people whose routines had been disrupted by something more exciting than the usual gossip. She found herself near the church as Mr. Crane emerged from the post office, his leather bag notably empty. He moved with less certainty than before, his usual precision replaced by the careful steps of someone navigating unfamiliar ground. "Mr. Crane?" Miss Marple adjusted her path to intersect with his. "I wonder if I might walk with you a moment?" His jaw tightened, but courtesy won out. "As you wish, miss." They walked in silence past the green, past cottages where people watched from windows. Miss Marple waited until they reached a bench near the duck pond before she spoke. "The inspector has been to see me. I expect he's been to see everyone." Mr. Crane's voice was hollow. "Asking questions, making accusations. He's doing his duty, much as you do yours." "My duty," he laughed, a sound without humor. 30 years delivering letters, rain or shine, never late, never careless. And now they think I'm involved in murder because I tried to protect my daughter. You did alter your route that Saturday morning." He turned to face her, his weathered face creased with anguish. "I delivered that letter Friday evening after my usual rounds. Miss Fenwick wasn't home, so I slipped it under the door. When I realized what it contained, Emily had confided in me about Miss Fenwick's kindness. I panicked. I went back early Saturday, hoping to retrieve it before she saw it. But the door was locked, and I couldn't—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "So I said I delivered it Saturday. I thought if the timing was confused, if there were questions, it might protect Emily from being drawn into whatever happened." "You knew something had happened?" "I knew Leonard Fenwick had been asking questions, pressing me about his aunt's correspondence, offering money if I'd tell him when letters arrived from London." His hands clenched. "I refused, of course, but I could see the desperation in him, the kind that makes men dangerous. You should tell the inspector this. And implicate my daughter. Let them think she had reason to want Miss Fenwick dead before she could change the will." He shook his head. "I'd rather hang than see Emily accused." "Mr. Crane, you don't understand, miss. Emily's been accused once already. Falsely accused. But mud sticks if they think she had motive and opportunity." He stood abruptly. "I've said too much. Good day, miss." He walked away across the green, his shoulders bent under a weight that had nothing to do with leather post-bags. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind arranging facts like pieces of a puzzle that refused to show its complete picture. That evening, Dr. Rowan called at Mrs. Ashworth's cottage. His face carried the grey exhaustion of someone who had gone without sleep. "The inspector questioned me for 2 hours," he said, accepting the whiskey Mrs. Ashworth poured with hands that trembled. "About digitalis, about access to Miss Fenwick's house, about my financial situation." He drank deeply. "I won't pretend my circumstances are comfortable. My investments failed spectacularly. But to suggest I would poison a patient— No one has accused you directly, Mrs. Ashworth said gently. Not yet. But suspicion is accusation enough in a village this size. He set down his glass. I prescribed a digitalis because Miss Fenwick needed it. I kept careful records of every dose. And yes, I visited her that Friday afternoon to check her heart rhythm. She was perfectly well when I left. You saw no one else there? Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Holt was in the garden. I let myself out. He paused. Though I did see Leonard Fenwick's motor car parked down the lane. I thought it odd at the time. He usually drove right up to the house. Did you mention this to the inspector? I did. He seemed quite interested. Dr. Rowan retrieved his bag. Forgive me for unburdening myself. I simply needed to speak to someone who might understand that desperation and murder are not the same thing. After he left, Miss Marple sat by the window, watching the last light fade from the sky. The village settled into its evening routines, lamps lit, curtains drawn, lives continuing despite the shadow that had fallen across them. What are you thinking, Jane? Mrs. Ashworth asked. I'm thinking, Miss Marple said slowly, that we have too many people with too many motives, and that somewhere in this tangle of need and fear and good intentions gone wrong, there is a pattern. One simply has to look at it from the correct angle. Her needles resumed their clicking rhythm, steady as a heartbeat, patient as time. Chapter 5. Hidden Letters and Village Parallels. Friday morning brought rain at last, the kind that fell steadily without drama, turning the village streets dark and the air heavy with the smell of wet earth. Miss Marple stood at Mrs. Ashworth's window, watching the postman's replacement navigate the rounds with considerably less grace than Mr. Crane had shown. The young man consulted a list at every gate, his uncertainty visible even from a distance. They've suspended Mr. Crane from his duties, Mrs. Ashworth said, joining her at the window, until the matter is settled. Has the inspector made an arrest? Not yet, but the village is convinced it's only a matter of time. Mrs. Ashworth lowered her voice, though they were alone. Opinion is divided between Leonard Fenwick and Dr. Rowan. No one wants to believe Mr. Crane capable of murder, but his lies have damaged him. Lies told to protect one's child are different from lies told to protect oneself. Are they? The inspector may not see the distinction. Miss Marple turned from the window. I think I shall call on Mrs. Crane this morning. A condolence visit regarding her husband's difficulties. The rain had eased to drizzle by the time they reached the Cranes' cottage. Mrs. Crane answered the door with a wary expression of someone who had endured too many sympathetic visits that concealed curiosity. Miss Marple, Mrs. Ashworth, how kind of you to call. Her voice suggested it was anything but kind, though courtesy demanded she admit them. The cottage interior was spotlessly clean, the kind of cleanliness that spoke of nervous energy seeking outlet. Emily sat by the window doing needlework, her fingers moving with mechanical precision. She acknowledged the visitors with a nod, but did not speak. Such a difficult time for you all, Mrs. Ashworth began. We're managing. Mrs. Crane's spine remained rigid as she poured tea. My husband is an honest man. The truth will prove it. I'm certain it will, Miss Marple said gently, though truth sometimes requires assistance to emerge. Emily's needlework stilled. What do you mean? I mean that patterns often reveal themselves when examined from the correct perspective. In St. Mary Mead, we had a situation not unlike yours. Emily, a young woman accused of theft, her reputation damaged despite no proof. It transpired that she had been blamed to cover another's crime, a crime committed by someone whose position made them above suspicion. That's exactly what happened to Emily, Mrs. Crane said, her composure cracking. Mrs. Palmer's own nephew took that money, we know it, but admitting that would shame the family, so Emily bore the blame instead. Did Miss Fenwick know this? Emily finally looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. she suspected. She called me to her house a fortnight ago, asked me direct questions about the incident. I told her everything, about seeing Mrs. Palmer's nephew in the church office the day before the money went missing, about how he'd asked me not to mention it. Miss Fenwick believed me, and she wished to help you. She said she'd been young once, falsely accused of something she hadn't done. She understood how such things followed a person. Emily's voice broke. She said she'd make it right, that she was changing her will to include a bequest that would let me start fresh somewhere else, away from the whispers. Did your father know this? Emily confided in him, yes, Mrs. Crane interjected, and Albert tried to protect her, just as any father would. When he realized that letter from the solicitor might put Emily in danger, might make her a suspect if something happened to Miss Fenwick. He panicked. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. He told me he delivered the letter Friday evening. He did. Slipped it under the door when no one answered his knock. Mrs. Crane's hands twisted in her lap, but Saturday morning he couldn't bear the weight of it. He went back, thinking he might retrieve it somehow. Warned Miss Fenwick that Leonard had been asking questions, but the house was locked and he was too late. Too late for what, precisely? Mrs. Crane's eyes filled with tears. Too late to save her, perhaps. Too late to prevent whatever Leonard Fenwick was planning. Albert knew the nephew was desperate. The man had practically begged him to intercept any legal correspondence, offered money my husband would never take. When Miss Fenwick died the very next day, Albert knew something terrible had happened. Yet he said nothing to the police initially. He was frightened for Emily. Can't you understand? If they knew about the will, about the bequest, they might think she had reason to want Miss Fenwick dead before the old lady could change her mind. Emily, fetch your father, Mrs. Crane said suddenly. He's in the garden shed. Trying to stay out of sight. The girl disappeared through the back door. Miss Marple set down her teacup, her expression thoughtful. The weight of unspoken truths hung in the room like morning fog. Mr. Crane entered through the kitchen, his clothes damp from the rain. His face carried the hollow look of a man who had carried a burden too heavy for too long. Tell her, Albert, Mrs. Crane said quietly. Tell her what you saw. He stood for a moment, water dripping from his coat onto the spotless floor. Then he spoke, his voice defeated. I went to the house that Saturday morning, the day she died. He looked at Miss Marple. I'd delivered that letter Friday evening, slipped it under the door when no one answered. All night I couldn't sleep, thinking about Emily, about what might happen if Leonard found out about the will change. So I went back, thinking I might warn Miss Fenwick, tell her about Leonard's questions, his desperation. And, Miss Marple prompted gently. The door was unlocked. Mrs. Holt must have left it so when she went to the garden. I went inside, calling out, but there was no answer. His hands clenched at his sides. I found her in her sitting room, in her chair, already gone. What did you see? The letter. His voice broke. The sealed letter from her solicitors, sitting there on the desk beside her. Unopened. She'd never read it, Miss Marple. Whatever happened to her, it happened before she could open that letter, before she could know what it said. You took nothing? Nothing. I couldn't move, couldn't think properly. I just stood there, realizing that she died, not knowing Emily would be provided for, not knowing her nephew would be disinherited. He swallowed hard. And then I saw Leonard Fenwick's motor car through the window, parked behind the hedge where no one would see it from the road. Did you touch the motor car? I went to it. The engine was still warm. He'd been there recently. Perhaps was still nearby. I panicked then, thought of Emily being drawn into this, being suspected. So I left without telling anyone what I'd seen. And the lie about delivering the letter Saturday? I thought if I confused the timing, if no one knew exactly when it arrived, it might protect Emily somehow. His shoulders sagged. I know it was foolish. I know I've made everything worse. But I couldn't bear to see my daughter destroyed by something that was meant to help her. Did you see anyone else at the house? Miss Marple asked. No. Just the motor car. Engine still warm. He looked at Emily. "I should have told the police straight away, but I thought they'd suspect her, think she had reason to want Miss Fenwick dead before the will could be changed." The room fell silent except for the rain drumming against the windows. Miss Marple's mind arranged the sequence of events like a picture emerging from mist. "In St. Mary Mead," she said quietly, "there was a case where a man lied to protect his daughter from suspicion. The lie nearly concealed a murder committed by someone else entirely. Someone who had counted on confusion, on protective instincts leading people to hide truths rather than reveal them." She looked at Mr. Crane. "You must tell Inspector Dryden everything you've just told me. Immediately. But Emily is innocent. Your testimony proves Leonard Fenwick was at the house when Miss Fenwick died, that his motor car was hidden, that the letter remained sealed and unread." Miss Marple stood. The person who murdered Miss Fenwick counted on confusion, on protective lies, on people acting from love rather than logic. We must not give them that advantage. Mr. Crane nodded slowly, his weathered face etched with resignation. "I'll go to him this afternoon. Tell him everything." "That would be wise," Miss Marple said. Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds broke apart to reveal patches of weak sunlight, illuminating the wet streets and making the cobblestones shine like dark mirrors. Miss Marple walked back through the village with Mrs. Ashworth, her needles already working through the pale blue wool that seemed to grow longer each day. "You know who did it," Mrs. Ashworth said. It was not a question. "I am beginning to see the pattern," Miss Marple replied. "But seeing and proving are different matters entirely. We must wait for Inspector Dryden to assemble the pieces in the correct order. And if he doesn't, then perhaps we must help him see what he's been looking at all along." Chapter 6. The Truth in Small Dishonesties. Inspector Dryden stood in Mrs. Ashworth's sitting room, his notebook open in his hand. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, catching the dust motes that drifted like tiny witnesses to the conversation. "Mr. Crane came to see me this morning." The inspector's voice carried a note of satisfaction. "Finally told me the truth about what he saw that Saturday." "He found Miss Fenwick already dead?" Miss Marple asked. "Dead in her chair, the sealed letter from her solicitors sitting unopened on the desk beside her, and Leonard Fenwick's motor car hidden behind the hedge, engine still warm." Inspector Dryden consulted his notes. "The timeline becomes clearer now. Have you spoken with Leonard Fenwick? He claims he visited his aunt Friday afternoon to discuss a loan. Says she refused him, told him she was tired of his irresponsibility. He left angry, drove to the public house in the next village, remained there until evening. The landlord confirms his presence from 4:30 onward." Miss Marple's needles paused. 4:30? Why does that trouble you? Mrs. Holt found Miss Fenwick dead at approximately 3:15. She had been cutting roses for perhaps 20 minutes, which places the time of death around 3 o'clock, possibly earlier. Inspector Dryden consulted his notebook. Dr. Rowan examined the body at 3:30. He estimated death had occurred within the previous hour, but couldn't be more precise. Digitalis poisoning doesn't announce itself with convenient timing. Yet Leonard Fenwick was at the house. So he admits, but if the death occurred at 3 and he arrived at 4... The inspector spread his hands. The poison would already have done its work, unless it was administered earlier than we've assumed. The tea was still warm when Mrs. Holt returned to the sitting room. Miss Fenwick had been drinking it. Mrs. Ashworth leaned forward. Could someone have poisoned the tea before Mrs. Holt left for the garden? Mrs. Holt prepared the tea herself at 2:30. She poured Miss Fenwick's cup, set out the biscuits, then went directly to the garden. The sitting room was empty during that time. Miss Fenwick was upstairs changing for afternoon callers. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needles clicking with metronomic precision. Who knew Miss Fenwick was expecting callers that afternoon? According to Mrs. Holt, no one was expected. Miss Fenwick had simply decided to dress properly in case anyone called, a habit from her younger days, apparently. How long was she upstairs? Mrs. Holt estimates 15 minutes, perhaps 20. Time enough to change her dress and arrange her hair. Inspector Dryden's eyes narrowed. You're suggesting someone entered during that window. I am suggesting that opportunity existed. The front door was unlocked. Villages are trusting places, Miss Marple said. People come and go through unlocked doors with considerable freedom, especially people who might be considered above suspicion. The inspector stood, pacing to the window and back. Dr. Rowan carries digitalis in his medical bag. He visited that Friday afternoon to check Miss Fenwick's heart. Mrs. Holt saw him leave at 2:15 before she prepared the tea. Rather convenient timing. He claims he left his bag briefly in the sitting room while he washed his hands in the downstairs lavatory. Says it's his habit. The bag contains items that shouldn't be handled with unwashed hands. And the bag was unattended for perhaps 3 minutes. But who would know it contained digitalis? Anyone who had been treated by Dr. Rowan, Miss Marple said. Anyone who had seen him prescribe it or administer it. In a village this size, medical matters are rarely private. Inspector Dryden returned to his chair. Leonard Fenwick suffered from heart palpitations 2 years ago. Dr. Rowan treated him with a brief course of digitalis. The nephew would have known exactly what was in that medical bag. The pieces were arranging themselves now, like a photograph developing in stages. Miss Marple could see the outline forming, though the details remained obscured. Did anyone see Leonard Fenwick near the house before 4 o'clock? She asked. Mrs. Fletcher observed his motor car on the lane behind Miss Fenwick's property around 2:30. She remarked on it because he usually parked in front. He was hiding his presence. So it appears. The inspector consulted his notes again. I confronted him with this information this morning. He became defensive, claimed he'd arrived early, but waited in his motor car, gathering courage to ask his aunt for money. Says he saw Dr. Rowan leave, then sat another half hour before approaching the house. A convenient story. Convenient, yes, but unprovable either way. Inspector Dryden closed his notebook with a sharp snap. What I cannot establish is exactly when the digitalis entered Miss Fenwick's tea. The doctor left at 2:15. Mrs. Holt prepared the tea at 2:30. Miss Fenwick came downstairs at 2:45, drank her tea and was dead by 3. The window is narrow. Narrow, but sufficient. Miss Marple set down her knitting, her expression thoughtful. Inspector, has anyone examined Dr. Rowan's medical bag since that afternoon? Why would we? Because if Leonard Fenwick took digitalis from it, there should be a discrepancy in the doctor's records. He would notice if a vial were missing or partially empty. The inspector's face shifted, something like respect entering his eyes. I'll have it checked immediately. You might also inquire whether Leonard Fenwick remained in his motor car the entire time he claims. Whether anyone saw him approach the house during those crucial minutes when Miss Fenwick was upstairs and the tea sat waiting in an empty room. The Reverend's study overlooks that side of the property. I'll speak with him. Inspector Dryden stood, reaching for his hat. You've been remarkably helpful, Miss Marple, almost as though you've been conducting your own investigation. Merely observing patterns, Inspector. Human nature repeats itself with tiresome regularity. Greed, fear, desperation, they manifest the same way in every generation. After he left, Mrs. Ashworth poured fresh tea with the air of someone seeking comfort in routine. Do you truly believe Leonard Fenwick murdered his aunt? I believe, Miss Marple said carefully, that he had motive, opportunity, and the knowledge necessary to commit the crime. I believe he attempted to bribe Mr. Crane to alert him about legal correspondence, which demonstrates premeditation. I believe he hid his motor car in his presence, which shows consciousness of guilt. But murder is rarely a matter of simple logic. It requires a particular kind of desperation, a moment when moral restraints collapse entirely. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. Leonard Fenwick is weak, dissolute, irresponsible. But is he a murderer? That remains to be proven. What will the inspector do? He will gather evidence. He will interview the Reverend, examine Dr. Rowan's bag, establish a timeline that either condemns or exonerates Leonard Fenwick. The needles clicked steadily. And if the evidence points where I believe it must, he will make an arrest. You sound almost sorry. Miss Marple considered this. I'm sorry for Mr. Crane, whose small dishonesty in service of love has nearly obscured the truth. I'm sorry for Emily, who has been twice victimized by circumstances beyond her control. I'm sorry for Mrs. Holt, who served faithfully and lost everything. I'm even sorry for Leonard Fenwick, if he is guilty, for the waste of a life that might have been different had he possessed stronger character. And if he's innocent, then someone else in this village committed murder with sufficient cunning to let suspicion fall on others, which would be far worse than simple greed or panic. Miss Marple looked out the window at the peaceful street, the ordered houses, the church spire rising against the late afternoon sky. Because calculated murder, dressed in the garments of respectability, is the most dangerous kind. It suggests a mind that can kill and then resume ordinary life without the weight of conscience. The church bells marked the hour, their sound rolling across the village like a summons. Somewhere in Wychcombe Saint Giles, a murderer went about their business, confident in the chaos their crime had created. But chaos, Miss Marple knew, was simply order waiting to be discovered, and she had spent a lifetime discovering such things. Epilogue. The arrest came on Saturday morning, swift and final as the fall of an axe. Leonard Fenwick had been preparing to leave Wychcombe Saint Giles, his aunt's house being prepared for sale, the inheritance secured, his debts paid. The motor car stood packed in the drive when Inspector Dryden arrived with 2 constables. The Reverend had seen him. That was what sealed it. From his study window overlooking the lane, the Reverend had observed Leonard Fenwick leave his motor car at 2:30 on that Friday afternoon. Had watched him approach Miss Fenwick's house through the garden, move with the furtive quickness of someone who did not wish to be seen. The Reverend had thought nothing of it at the time. A nephew visiting his aunt required no explanation. Only later, when the times were examined, when the lies accumulated like sediment, did the observation gain significance. Dr. Rowan's medical bag had revealed the rest. A vial of digitalis, half empty when it should have been full. The doctor kept meticulous records. He had used only 3 doses since refilling the vial. The missing amount would have been more than sufficient to stop a weakened heart. Leonard Fenwick had taken it during those 3 minutes when the bag sat unattended. Had carried it to his motor car, hidden on the lane. Had waited until his aunt went upstairs, until the house stood empty except for Mrs. Holt cutting roses in the distant garden. Had slipped through the unlocked door, poured the digitalis into the waiting teacup, stirred it carefully into the milk and sugar that would mask its bitter taste. Then he had returned to his motor car and waited. Waited until enough time had passed, until he could arrive openly at 4 o'clock and find his aunt already beyond help. The perfect crime, or so he had imagined. But Leonard Fenwick had not accounted for the web of his own deceptions unraveling. Had not anticipated that the postman's lie about the letter delivery would draw Miss Marple's attention. Had not considered that his own attempts to bribe information about legal correspondence would be remembered, examined, used to establish motive and premeditation. Had not realized that Mr. Crane would eventually tell the truth about finding Miss Fenwick dead, with the sealed letter still unopened beside her, and Leonard's motor car hidden nearby with its engine warm. Small lies and careful observations had unraveled his careful plan. The postman's confusion about delivery dates, born from panic and love. The Reverend's observation, mentioned only when asked. Dr. Rowan's precise record-keeping. Mrs. Fletcher's casual notice of a motor car parked in an unusual place. Mr. Crane's testimony about the unopened letter and the hidden motor car. Truth, Miss Marple reflected, had a way of assembling itself from scattered fragments. She heard the news from Mrs. Ashworth, who had it from Mrs. Palmer, who had witnessed the arrest from her drawing-room windows. The village had gathered in clusters, speaking in hushed tones of murder and greed and the corruption of a man who had killed his own blood for money he would gamble away within the year. Mr. Crane returned to his post the following Monday, his route unchanged, his punctuality restored. But something had altered in him. The certainty that had marked 30 years of service had given way to a more cautious tread, a hesitation before each delivery. He had learned that even small lies cast long shadows. Emily Crane left Wychcombe Saint Giles a fortnight later. Miss Fenwick's previous will, never superseded, contained a small bequest after all, not the substantial sum the new will would have provided, but enough to allow the girl a fresh start in another county. She carried with her a letter from Miss Marple, introducing her to a friend who needed a companion, someone who understood the value of second chances. Mrs. Holt found a position with a family in Somerset. She wrote to Miss Marple once, a brief note expressing gratitude for justice served. "I knew something was wrong," she had written. "The unopened letter troubled me greatly. Miss Fenwick would never have left correspondence unread." Miss Marple sat in Mrs. Ashworth's garden on her last afternoon in the village, her knitting nearly complete. The blue wool had become a shawl, each stitch representing hours of thought, of observation, of patient assembly of facts. "You knew from the beginning," Mrs. Ashworth said. "It was not a question. Not from the beginning, but once the pattern emerged, it was merely a matter of seeing it clearly." Miss Marple's needles paused. Leonard Fenwick's desperation, Mr. Crane's unusual lie, the unopened letter beside a woman who always read her post immediately. Each piece pointed toward a truth that someone had tried very hard to obscure. And if Mr. Crane had not lied, if he had simply delivered the letter as usual and said nothing, then Leonard Fenwick might have escaped detection entirely. His plan was sound enough. Poison administered in an empty house, alibi established at the public house, death appearing natural until the body was examined. But Mr. Crane's protective instinct disrupted the expected pattern. And disrupted patterns, Miss Marple said with a faint smile, are always worth investigating. She finished the last row and cast off, her hands moving with the ease of long practice. The shawl lay complete in her lap, whole and serviceable, ready for use. Wychcombe Saint Giles returned to its routines. The new postman learned his route. The ducks reclaimed the pond. Life continued with the inexorable rhythm of villages where one scandal would eventually be supplanted by another. But those who had lived through the events of that week carried the knowledge forward. That routine could mask treachery, that trust required vigilance, and that even the most reliable footsteps could falter when tested by greed and fear. Miss Marple returned to St. Mary Mead on a Tuesday morning. Her visit concluded. She carried with her another story, another pattern observed and understood. Human nature, she reflected as the train pulled away from Wychcombe Holt, remained disappointingly consistent, and yet in that consistency there was also comfort. For if wickedness repeated itself, so too did courage, loyalty, and love, even when that love led good people into small dishonesties that nearly concealed murder. The train gathered speed, carrying her toward home and the familiar rhythms of her own village, where doubtless other patterns waited to be discovered. Other truths waited to emerge from the careful observation of ordinary lives. She took up her knitting and began again. The final page has been read, and what was once overlooked has been brought into focus. Not every truth announces itself loudly. Some wait quietly until someone is willing to look again. This story now returns to its place among the shelves of the hidden library, no longer forgotten but remembered. If this mystery stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Until another volume is taken down, remember, Silence does not erase the past. It only delays its return.